Be opening up to Acts chapter 8. Acts chapter 8 is where we're going to focus our attention. It's where we're going to spend most of our time this evening. So if you've got the New Testament, be opening up there to Acts chapter 8, and that's where we'll get started in just a moment. There are some things that they never prepare you for about becoming a parent. And you're already laughing. I am back there and I'm pulling out my iPad. In case you guys don't know, I have my slides on here too. That's why I have this up here. And if you've operated an iPad before, when you open it up, what opens up is what was most recently displayed on the screen. I did not have my iPad most recently. Someone else in my family did. And Bluey popped up on the screen. And we almost heard the Bluey jingle in our song there. So that is going to happen someday, and I'm just going to apologize now for it because it's not intentional, right? So Bluey was there with us. But you're there in Acts chapter 8, Hechos capítulo 8. We want to talk this evening about the Ethiopian eunuch and a slightly different take on the Ethiopian eunuch, one that you may have never heard before. And I hesitate to preach a sermon like this. I don't like introducing new ideas that could make the text more challenging for people. I generally don't think of that as a beneficial thing. However, this is an issue that has come up amongst at least one of our members, not in a negative way, but in a positive way. One of our members was engaged with a member of the community that you'll see in just a moment, and the subject of the Ethiopian eunuch came up in a very pertinent way, and something we need to reason about together this evening. So I've simply entitled this, New Eyes on the Ethiopian Eunuch, looking at what is happening here in Acts chapter 8. Peyton did a good job reading for us this small section from Acts chapter 8. Peyton only read for us verses 26 and 27, and that's really all that I needed him to read right there. It introduces to us the two characters in the story, Philip and this man from Ethiopia who was called a eunuch. The eunuch is reading from the scroll of Isaiah. He is returning ostensibly from worshiping in Jerusalem. He is reading the scroll of Isaiah. He is having trouble understanding it. Philip is guided by the Holy Spirit to run and overtake the eunuch's chariot. Philip, as he reaches the eunuch, comes to him and says in verse 30, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And the eunuch responded and said, "Well, how could I unless someone guides me?" Philip then gets to the eunuch. He reads where he is in Isaiah, and verse 35 tells us, beginning from that scripture, Philip preached to him Jesus. And take a special note in verses 36 through 39. We'll read that together here. Philip is preaching Jesus to the eunuch, and as they went along the road, they came to some water. And the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" And some translations add here in verse 37, Philip answered and said, "If you believe with all of your heart, you may." And the eunuch answered, "I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And in verse 38, he ordered the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip as well as the eunuch, and he baptized him. That is, Philip baptized the eunuch. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, but the eunuch saw him no more, but he went on his way rejoicing. One of our members was in correspondence with a leading figure at Colonial Hills United Methodist Church here in San Antonio, and just submitted this simple question: does Colonial Hills United Methodist Church condone gay and lesbian clergy? The official response that came was, "Thank you for your question. I wonder what exactly do you mean by condone?" And there was a little bit more before this. Don't think it was just this kind of harsh response in this manner. I wonder, what exactly do you mean by condone? What about queer folks like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts? He asks a question: what is there to prevent me from being baptized? I read that and I thought, in the about 3-paragraph response that was there, I was like, that strikes me. Out of all of the teachings in Scripture one could attempt to use to defend the practice of homosexuality, this gentleman says, well, what about queer folks like the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts? And so I did some more digging. And I was aware of a little bit of this, but there is an entire line of reasoning out there that says that because this Ethiopian was a eunuch, what that means is that he was a practicer of homosexuality. And so the argument goes that, well, because he is identified as a eunuch, that identifies him as a homosexual. And in spite of his homosexuality, he was received by Philip. He accepted the gospel, and he went on his way rejoicing, and he didn't have to stop being what he was. And so homosexual activity is not sinful. That's the sum and substance of the argument, and that's what we want to deal with a little bit this evening. Before we start in this, 3 things we need to remember. And I've become more convinced that as we talk about especially the issue of homosexuality, we need to keep these 3 principles in mind. Number 1, God does not invite us to do evil that good may come. That just because we might disagree with somebody about some choice that they make in their life does not give us the right to behave in ways that are ungodly and fail to conform to the manner and the life of Christ. We don't do evil so that good may come. Secondly, we need to remember that homosexuality is not a sin that is worse than other sins. The sin of homosexuality is classed in the New Testament under the broad heading of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality is condemned in Galatians 5:19, these works of the flesh, along with several other sins, right? Sins like wrath, sins like anger and disputes and things like that. So we should not class homosexuality as a sin off to itself, a sin that is worse than other sins. That's simply not the New Testament presentation of the issue. And number 3, we are called to be kind and to be patient and to treat other people the way that we want to be treated. And so whenever we engage in this topic with others, maybe some who might be struggling with this very issue, we need to remember to be kind and to be patient, like we read the fruit of the Spirit there in Galatians chapter 5. We need to treat other people how we want to be treated. We need to speak to others the way that we would want to be spoken to. We need to reason with people the way that we would want them to reason with us. That's indeed what Jesus says in Matthew 7 when he gives us the golden rule. Now, that being said and understood, we're off to our question. Was the Ethiopian eunuch a homosexual? And you might be sitting there in your pew this evening thinking, Tyler, I never even thought this was a question. I'm sorry to bring it up. But as you can see, there are some in the religious community around us who would look to this story in Acts 8 and set forth an affirmation that what we see is the acceptance of homosexuality under the direction of the Holy Spirit, and so we then are guided to accept that as well. And this then is why we need to have this discussion. Here is how this argument is presented. I've got several footnoted articles you can refer to later if you want to that present this argument in greater detail. Obviously, I'm not going to present it in the greatest detail. That would take too long. But here are two or three summaries. The argument is that, quote, a queer black man was welcomed as an early Christian convert in biblical times, according to progressive Bible scholars. He was a triple outsider, a gender-variant foreigner from a racial minority, and his story shows that the early Christians welcomed all kinds of outcasts. Another article goes on to say this: from a queer perspective, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 can be read productively as a drag show with implications for inclusion in early Christian communities. That is how the argument generally is presented. Here is how the argument is generally defended. Those who would see in the story of the Ethiopian eunuch an ethic for accepting homosexual activity under the broad scope of Holy Spirit direction, they would say that the term translated as eunuch included a variety of sexual minorities that today might be called queer or LGBT. Now, if you read your bulletin article this morning, which I'm sure you all dutifully did before you arrived to the church building, you're going to see a lot of overlap between our bulletin article this morning and what we're presenting tonight, and that's by design because there is a lot of overlap there. Another defended the argument by saying this: biblical eunuchs can stand for all sexual minorities. Another, eunuchs were sexual outcasts in Jewish religious society, much like LGBTQ people are in the church today. And another argued this way: under the symbol of eunuch, this prophecy includes the homosexual, because the word eunuch in the New Testament is used not only in the literal sense to mean those who have been physically castrated, but also in a symbolic sense for all those who for any reason do not marry and bear children. And that, of course, is going to be a reference to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19 after he gives his teaching on marriage and divorce and remarriage. You remember what Jesus' disciples said there in Matthew chapter 19 around verse 11? He said, well, if what you're saying is true, Jesus, it's better for a man if he doesn't even marry at all. And what was Jesus' response? Do you remember? He said, not everyone can accept that statement. Some can. And he gives three classes of eunuchs, right? Eunuchs who were born that way, eunuchs who were made that way, and those who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So the argument here about the Ethiopian eunuch is simply this: because he is called a eunuch, that term eunuch implies, at least to some of these scholars, implies homosexual conduct and homosexual activity. And so when you read eunuch, read homosexual. And therefore, since he was accepted in spite of his homosexuality, in spite of his being a eunuch, we need to accept those who choose to engage in homosexual activity because the eunuch was accepted. That is how the argument goes, and that is how the argument is defended. Just in the first instance here, you've got, if you like logic, you see a very clear logical fallacy here. And there's a lot of different names that are given to this logical fallacy. Sometimes it's called proof by example. Sometimes it's called the composition fallacy. There's a little bit of what's a really fun one to say, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. And the idea behind this logical fallacy is you take a part of a whole, and it has condition X, and you say, well, since it's part of the whole, the entire whole has this X. Here's how it is in more practical terms. We got little Billy right here, not Billy over there, little Billy right here. Little Billy says, I'm made of atoms. Atoms are invisible, therefore, I am invisible. And of course, he's found immediately while they play hide and seek. Just because one thing is true does not mean all of it follows, correct? Just because he's made of atoms does not mean that he is invisible because atoms are invisible. Just because one thing is true in one part of this class does not mean it's true for the entire class. Just because you can find in Greek and Roman literature some eunuchs who did engage in homosexual activity does not mean that homosexual activity was a necessity for all those who were eunuchs. Now, we recognize that kind of logical fallacy in several other things in this life, and I know we need to see that here. And that is then why, as you go through so many of these articles, you see this hedged language, right? This first quotation. The term translated as eunuch included a variety of sexual minorities that today, what? Might. We've got to hedge our language there. Or in the second quotation, biblical eunuchs can stand for all sexual minorities. In fact, there are a couple of noted scholars who fall on the homosexual side of this issue who have the academic honesty to come out and say, just because the term eunuch is used does not mean that he was a homosexual. They say there is overlap amongst some, but that is not demanded by the word. And that's the truth. And understanding that truth, this issue really then should crumble. Because it is entirely wrapped up on the idea of this word meaning or having an absolute connotation of one who is a homosexual, and that simply is not demonstrated. If we're going to talk about how the Bible uses the term, and we're looking at a Bible passage, let's broaden this out. Let's look at the entire New Testament, and then let's look at the entire Old Testament. In the New Testament, the term is used 8 times. All of them either in Matthew 19 or Acts chapter 8. Those are the only times this term is going to be used in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the corresponding Hebrew word for eunuch, which is saris, is going to be used 44 times, spread across the entirety of the Old Testament. Number one is this word eunuch is never, ever used in a sexual context. You will never see someone described as engaging in a sexual relationship, homosexual, heterosexual, or otherwise, and this term eunuch being invoked in that context. It is never used in a sexual context. So if we are dealing with a piece of literature and we're trying to understand a word in the context of that literature, we would look at how that term is used throughout the rest of the document, wouldn't we? To understand what that word means. It's like how we all used to laugh when we were studying the Constitution, right? And you're going through the amendments. And we have a Second Amendment right to do what? Bear arms. And then you had the one goober in class who sit down and drew George Washington with huge bear arms, right? Bear claws and all that. And we laughed about it. Ha ha, he's got bear arms. We have the right to bear arms. Of course, you read the rest of the document in its context, and of course, we're not talking about having the arms of an animal bear. We're talking about the right to take up arms, things like that. When we take a word and read it in its context, that shows us what that word means. When we go through the New Testament and we broaden it out to the entire Bible, we never see this word used in a sexual context. That ought to be our first clue. Number two, as we look at this Hebrew word saris, there's something unique that happens. I want you to come in your Old Testaments to Genesis 39. Genesis capítulo 39, verso 1. Genesis 39. I want you to look at verse 1. This Hebrew word saris, which is the corresponding word to the Greek word for eunuch, used 44 times in the Old Testament, is interestingly used to describe a married man. It's used to describe Potiphar in Genesis 39. Except in most of our Bibles, it's not going to be rendered eunuch. It's going to be rendered as officer. Now Joseph, this is chapter 39 and verse 1, capítulo 39, verso 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And Potiphar is later in chapter 39 again going to be identified as saris, as either an officer or a eunuch. Now, I bring that to our attention for this reason. There is one particular line of reasoning in this argument that says that the common denominator in gay men and castrated men, eunuchs, which could be the basis for categorizing both groups under the term eunuch, is that neither one is suitable for marriage. Neither one is suitable for marriage. And they're going to base that partly off of Acts 8, mostly off of Matthew 19, where that term eunuch is employed, and Jesus talks about the three different kinds of eunuchs. Not fit for marriage. This argument, though, crumbles when you come to Genesis 39 and you see this word for eunuch being used to describe whom? A man who is what? A man who is married. So the entire idea that this term eunuch just stands for those who are not suited for marriage falters under the weight of itself as we work through the Bible. And so this argument, this specific line of reasoning crumbles. The use of the term saris to describe married Potiphar deals a blow to the idea that eunuchs, or saris, are inherently sexualized terms. In fact, this term saris simply means official, oftentimes throughout the Old Testament, 1 Samuel chapter 8 being a great example of that. It doesn't always mean one who has undergone some sort of process whereby he is unable to sire children. Sometimes it just means official or officer. So that's how the Bible uses the term eunuch. But there was another line of reasoning that we saw in those quotations earlier, and that is, and I know this can be kind of uncomfortable. I don't mean to make this uncomfortable for anybody. We're going to try to handle this in the most above board and soft-gloved fashion that there is. But there is a cultural context for queer. Do you remember our first quotation described the Ethiopian eunuch as a queer black man? That term is used often and it's poorly defined. Poorly defined. I understand we come from a wide age of, or a wide disparity of ages in our assembly tonight. Some of you grew up using the term queer simply to describe something that was odd or different, right? When I was growing up, it took on a rather pejorative connotation to describe somebody who had same-sex inclination. And now that term has kind of been brought in by those under the LGBTQ umbrella as almost a badge of pride. And so trying to take that term and turn it into something different in their minds. But what do these authors mean when they describe the Ethiopian eunuch as queer? What does that mean? There are some in that camp who would make the leap to homosexuality. Now, the Ethiopian eunuch, because he was a eunuch, was a homosexual. That we've already demonstrated the fallacy of that argument. That's simply not demonstrated. But others use the term to reference any sort of sexual difference. I'll say that again. Any sort of sexual difference. Sean D. Burke, in his article entitled Ethiopian Eunuch from a Queer Perspective, published in Bible Odyssey, he said that because the Ethiopian eunuch was sexually different, he fits the category of queer, which fits the broader category of LGBT+. Here was his exact quotation: eunuchs in the ancient royal courts can be interpreted productively as drag performers because they queered, which means troubled, he says, or destabilized the intersecting oppositions on which masculinity depended: male, female, masculine, feminine, and so forth. They were defined as foreign because of the stigma around castration. Their bodies included a mixture of features normatively coded as masculine and feminine. The argument is this: the Ethiopian eunuch was sexually different. His sexual difference was being unable to father children. Because he was sexually different in that way, that makes him queer. And being queer makes you part of the LGBTQ plus movement. So sexually different equals LGBTQ plus ally. That's a pretty startling argument. Number one, is that how any of us use the term queer? We hear that word today, even used in homosexual circles. Does anybody take that word queer and think sexually different in any way, shape, or form, including reproductive issues? Nobody thinks that. But this is the argument that's presented. Because he is sexually different when it comes to reproduction, that is, he has an inability to reproduce, that makes him queer, that makes him LGBTQ plus. So a disability or a sexual inability, by that logic, places somebody in the LGBTQ plus camp. I guess we're going to throw Hannah in there in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hebrew Hannah. Hannah, who was a servant of the Lord. Hannah, who was there worshiping in 1 Samuel. Hannah, who as a Hebrew who is submitting to Jehovah of Israel. Hannah, who would have understood that homosexual activity was an abomination. We're going to say she's in the LGBTQ plus camp? Because her womb was what? Her womb was closed, 1 Samuel 1 tells us. Now, I know I'm from Arkansas. That doesn't even make good nonsense. But then, what about Sarah? From Genesis 12 to Genesis 21. Is she in the LGBTQ plus camp? Because she had a womb that was what? For these 10 chapters, her womb is closed. But then the Lord opens her womb in chapter 21, and she's going to have a child. When her womb opens, is she out of the LGBTQ plus camp? Because she's now reproductively, quote unquote, normal? This is an argument that's not very well thought out, is it? It doesn't prove what the authors are wanting it to prove. Can you imagine if the situation was reversed? Could you imagine walking up to people and saying, well, because you have said the word God in your life, that means you're not an atheist? Well, of course not. Because you've said the word God in your life, that makes you a Christian. Would that not be the same thing as this argument? How bold it is to claim something for someone else. Not only how bold, how wrong. Let's bring this home. What is going on in Acts 8? Here's what's going on in Acts 8. Number one, nothing in the text indicates that the Ethiopian eunuch engaged in homosexual activity. And those who are out there writing about this from the homosexual perspective, those who are truly scholarly, affirm this. That there is nothing that demonstrates that the Ethiopian eunuch was a homosexual, that it is all speculation. These are coulds and mights and maybes and possiblies. I don't know about you. I don't want to build my life on coulds and maybes and mights and possibilities. It seems like a really bad place to build a life. Seems like building on sand and not building on rock. And Jesus exposes the folly of that in Matthew chapter 7. The term eunuch does not demand a homosexual connotation. Now, if I'm going to jump back here real quick. I want you to see this quote again. A queer black man was welcomed as an early Christian convert in Bible times. Now, I don't know specifically about the Ethiopian eunuch, but I can tell you this. There were people in the early Christian community who accepted people who were quote-unquote queer in the way that we use the term today, meaning those who were practicers of homosexuality. We have examples of people like that that were accepted in the New Testament church. Could I show you an example? 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Primera de Corintios capítulo 6, verso 9. The early church, under the guidance of the apostles who were selected and appointed by Jesus and inspired by the Holy Spirit, that early church did welcome homosexuals. But they welcomed them once they repented of their sinful lifestyle and stopped practicing homosexuality. Here's how we know that. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, look at verse 9. Do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers shall inherit the kingdom of God. Focus your attention tonight just on that word homosexuals. Will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then focus on the first phrase in verse 11. Verso 11. And such were what? And such were some of you. Here are people who were, by society standards, quote unquote, queer. Homosexuals who were accepted by the church, accepted by the Spirit, accepted under the guidance of the apostles. Yet, how were they accepted? Pay attention to our verbs and our tenses there in chapter 6 and verse 11. Such what were. These are people who had engaged in these activities in the past but had left them behind. Such were some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. The gospel of Jesus Christ is clear. Homosexuality, homosexual activity is incompatible with being a follower of Jesus. We can't have both. It's one or the other. But the beautiful thing is that no matter what sin I might have committed in the past, the blood of Christ and the grace of God is sufficient to forgive it. I don't have to be defined by how I once lived, the people I once associated with, and the things that I once did. I can be freed from that burden. I can be freed from the weight of sin. I can be freed from the shackles of my own decisions. And I can find peace, and I can find hope, and I can find refuge, and I can find forgiveness and fellowship with God when I submit to Jesus Christ. And that's what we see in the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. We see a man who was seeking to know God, don't we? He was reading from the scroll in Isaiah. He's reading from a section in Isaiah that's very close to a section of Isaiah that talks about eunuchs and how they had hope and how God would bring them in, that their hope would be realized. I think it's very likely that he had been reading in that section and he's bouncing around in areas of Isaiah that are right next to it, and he happens upon Isaiah 53. Who is this man? He asked Philip. Beginning at that scripture, Philip did what? Preached to him Jesus. How did the Ethiopian eunuch find God? Through God's revelation. The same way you and I will find God today. Through his revelation. Beginning at that scripture, Philip preached to him Jesus. He found God through his revelation, the God who has always placed sexual activity in the confines of marriage. Before Sinai, before the law of Moses, during the law of Moses, and in the time of the gospel of Christ. Genesis 2, Matthew 19. This has been God's law all along. That sexual activity, this oneness, occurs where? In the confines of marriage. And those same passages, Genesis 2 and Matthew 19, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them what? Male and female, and said, for this reason shall a man leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife or to his woman, and the two shall become one flesh. Notice you have the inspired usage of both terms there, man and woman, and male and female. God defines for us as well what marriage is. The relationship where sexual activity is appropriate is also defined by God as a union consisting of one man and one woman, one male and one female. The eunuch found God through his revelation, and the eunuch found God through Christ. Beginning at that scripture, he preached to him Jesus. They came to water. The eunuch said, "See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" As Jesus was preached to the eunuch, one of the issues that came up organically was the issue of baptism. This wouldn't have been something that was commanded in the Old Testament. It simply wasn't commanded in the Old Testament. But it was something that was commanded here. He preached to him Jesus. And he said, "See, here is water. What hinders me from being baptized?" If you believe with all of your heart, you may. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, that commanded the chariot to stand still. Both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and he baptized him. The Spirit caught Philip away, but the eunuch went on his way rejoicing. Rejoicing why? What has the book of Acts told us about baptism? Repentance and baptism leads to the forgiveness of sins. Or what Paul was told in chapter 22 and verse 16, "Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, call on the name of the Lord." He had a reason to go on his way rejoicing. He was now experiencing the promises of God. The promises he had read about in the book of Isaiah had come to fruition in his own life. You and I can be partakers of those same promises. We can have that same hope. We can have that same pardon and forgiveness and joy that the eunuch had if we'll simply follow Jesus, if we'll submit to God and hear his law. If you need to respond to the gospel in any way this evening, would you come while we stand and while we sing?